Hello, brilliant anatomists and physiologists. Welcome to the endocrine system. This is our first lecture of Bio 202, part of Unit 1. So let's go ahead and get started. Like I mentioned, these are the preview slides. So you're going to study them on your own. We're not going to do those like an actual lecture when lectures are in person. You are expected to know the material for the unit and final exams, but I will take time just to go through some key points here. Okay, so the overview of the endocrine system, right? What's just always important to know what we're looking at, what the functions of the system we're looking at are, right? What makes up the system. So in this case, right, the functions of the endocrine system, metabolism, growth, development, right, helps us with regulate our emotions and our mood and regulate fertility and sexual function, both for biological females and biological males. There's a few components that make up the endocrine system, right? The endocrine glands, those are the glands that are actually producing our hormones. And hormones, like it says here, are these chemical messengers, right? They're going to be secreted into the bloodstream, and they're either going to stimulate or inhibit, right, a response in another tissue or organ. And then those target cells, right, that's really the tissue or organ have things called target cells, right? And these are those receptors for the hormone, and they're just very similar, right? They're structured in such a way that signals for that specific hormone. So this hormone is acting on the correct target cell. Okay, so there's three main types of hormone release mechanisms. I would honestly argue that all three of these occur. So hormones kind of actually undergo all three of these release mechanisms. So the first one is neurally. It's also called neuronally, but that's, I don't know, very difficult to say, I feel like. So neurally, what that just means is that either we're going to release or inhibit the release, right? So stop the release of hormones due to like our emotions and stress, right? So our emotional state actually can either release more hormones of a specific type or can stop the release of those hormones, right? So if you, for example, if you think about in a stressful situation, right? Like I always use the running from a bear narrative or having a exam coming up, right? So those types of emotions, that stress, that anxiety are going to secrete specific hormones that we're going to talk about later on and inhibit other ones, right? Or certain parts of the biological female menstrual cycle, right? It's going to, certain parts of that 28-day cycle is either going to have a secretion or inhibition of certain hormones. Again, we'll talk about that, the specifics of the biological female menstrual cycle at the end of the semester, but just to give you some examples. That humorally, which is also referred to as non-hormonally. So humorally means that the release of these hormones are actually dependent on concentration of a non-hormonal substance in the blood, right? So for example, like glucose. We'll learn in this unit that high levels of glucose in the blood are actually going to stimulate the increase of insulin hormone, right? And inhibit the release of the glucagon hormone. So what that just means is, again, dependent on the type of levels in our blood, what we have, it's a non-hormonal substance, though, is what's stimulating it. So glucose, we'll learn about calcium, right? Calcium levels in the blood. Those are neither calcium or glucose or hormones, right? And so, but those types of substances are actually going to affect how much affect the release of a specific hormone, right? And the levels of that hormone being released or inhibited for that matter. And so the last one is hormonally, right? So this is the control of a hormone or the release or inhibition of a hormone by another hormone. So we'll learn a little bit more about that. And the hormones that actually regulate, so either cause the secretion or stop the release of other hormones are called tropic hormones. So we'll learn again a little bit more specifics as we go on. Okay, so there are two main types or classifications of hormones. The first one is hydrophobic. So phobic, right, this word here, phobic, hopefully that X isn't in the way, I'm sorry. But phobic means like scared, right, or fearing. So hydrophobic hormones are afraid of water, they hate water, right? So that means that they're lipid soluble, meaning that they can there's, like I said, soluble in lipids or fats, right? But they're not soluble in water, so they're not going to mix with water. And so hydrophobic hormones are derived from a type of lipid called cholesterol. Okay, and because they are not water soluble, they cannot just be transported very easily through our bloodstream, right? So they actually have to bind to what's called blood plasma proteins to be transported and actually protected, right? So what happens is if they're not bound to these blood plasma transport proteins, they actually can get excreted in our or secreted in our urine. So hydrophobic hormones, like our sex steroids and corticosteroids, right? They have to bind to a blood plasma protein in order to move throughout the body to get to the target cell, right? Now, another important thing to note about hydrophobic hormones is that they have to bind to intracellular receptors, right? So what that means is they're actually going through, right, the membrane, right? We have a bilipid membrane, if you remember from 201 and hopefully biology. So hydrophobic hormones are actually going to go through that lipid membrane to act directly on the DNA in our nucleus, right? So this big purple thing is our nucleus that holds our DNA, right? And it's going to either turn on gene transcription. So also note, only unbound hormones can leave capillary, right? Meaning can leave the bloodstream to reach a target cell. Right, so yes, these hormones do have to use these blood plasma transport proteins to move through the capillaries, to move the blood inside the capillaries, right? But they have to at some point detach, right, from those transport proteins in order to do their function, right? So blood transport proteins cannot come through the cell. And again, the most common types are sex steroids and corticosteroids. So sex steroids like estrogen, testosterone, progesterone, and corticosteroids, we're going to learn a little bit more about those, right? So those are the main types of hydrophobic hormones. Now we have hydrophilic, right? So philic, right? This means that they love water. So hydrophilic hormones are made from polypeptides and proteins. So they love water, so they're water soluble, but lipid insoluble. So that's why hydrophilic hormones cannot cross that bilipid membrane, right? So they don't actually come into the cell. Instead, what they do is they bind to membrane-bound receptors, right? So we have a cell here, this whole light pinkish thing with that orangish-looking circle in the center. So this is the nucleus of this big cell, right? We see these blue Pac-Man-looking things. These are the sulfurous receptors. These are our hormones actually just kind of floating freely in our blood plasma, right? So they mix easily with our blood plasma. They don't need transport proteins because they're water loving, right? And so what happens is that these are going to bind to membrane bound, right? So these receptors are sitting on the outside of the cell on the membrane. Okay, so the hormones are not crossing this lipid membrane to go to the nucleus, right? Not hydrophilic ones. The hydrophilic ones are just going to bound to membrane receptors here. Okay, and those examples, like I said, include oxytocin, ADH or antidiuretic hormone, all of the releasing inhibiting hormones of the hypothalamus, and most of the anterior pituitary hormones. Okay. Well, again, we'll get into the specifics of these, but just to give you some context. All right, so that's the end of the preview slides. Again, I know we didn't go through those necessarily in in-person lecture, but I wanted to give you just a little bit more explanation here. So let's go ahead and dive right in. So if you remember from 201, I know some of you have taken 201 a while ago, but just a brief reintroduction to the hypothalamus, right? This structure here that's located, it's an endocrine gland located in the diencephalon, so that's part of our brain. And its function is to really integrate, right, connect that endocrine and the nervous systems together, right? And so really what this hypothalamus does, it has a lot of great functions. Those like primitive functions, like, right, making sure that we maintain our water and sodium balance, making sure that, we're eating, we're able to grow, and also our sex drive, right? To have that sex drive so we can reproduce, have offspring or children, right? Because we're humans, right? And so the hypothalamus is really just the core of who we are as primitive, human beings. Okay, and so we're going to find out in a moment how the hormones that are secreted are actually also synthesized. So they're synthesized, which means made and secreted into the pituitary gland. Okay, and so This right here is my way of kind of just demonstrating that it starts at the hypothalamus, and now our hypothalamus, let me back up one moment, right? Our hypothalamus is over here. You can see that it's connected to a posterior pituitary and an anterior pituitary, okay? And so what I'm essentially saying here is that there's the hypothalamus, and it's connected to the posterior pituitary gland by what's called the hypothalamo-hypophyseal tract. Okay. The hypothalamus is also connected to the anterior pituitary gland by the hypophyseal tract portal system. As you can tell, it's a mouthful. So knowing the difference between the two, So understanding the difference between the two is that hypothalamo-hypophyseal tract leads to the posterior pituitary. So the posterior pituitary is an extension of the hypothalamus, right? So it's that extension. This is where we're going to store and secrete two specific hormones we'll talk about. Now, the hypothalamo-hypophyseal portal system is where the hypothalamus is connected to the anterior pituitary. Now, one thing to note is the anterior pituitary is what's called a true endocrine gland. What that means is it's a gland all on its own. It's a separate gland, whereas the posterior pituitary is just an extension of the hypothalamus. This is a true endocrine gland, right? And the anterior pituitary is actually going to produce and secrete these regulatory hormones. So posterior pituitary is just going to store and secrete two hormones, whereas anterior pituitary is going to produce and secrete them. Okay, so posterior pituitary is storing these two specific hormones that are coming directly from the hypothalamus, whereas anterior pituitary is going to produce these hormones. Okay, so we're going to start off first with the tract that sends us from the hypothalamus down to the posterior pituitary. Okay, so this tract is actually just a collection of axons that are connecting only to the posterior pituitary, right? And this tract is located inside what's called the pituitary stalk or the infundibulum. All right, so one of the two hormones that we've talked about in the posterior pituitary is called ADH, or antidiuretic hormone. It's also known as vasopressin. I would understand it as, or be able to acknowledge it as both ADH and vasopressin. Okay. ADH is released when blood solute concentration is too high. What that means is that there's too much salt in the blood, too much ions like calcium. It's really just too much salt, really. And so because there's too much salt concentration, that means our water concentration is too low. So we have a very low blood volume and blood pressure. So what happens is ADH is actually released to increase water reabsorption in the kidneys. Right? So ADH is released, we increase water reabsorption, we're not going to urinate, right? So what that does is it's going to increase our blood volume and in turn our blood pressure, right? By increasing our water. We're going to decrease urine production or diuresis, so we're not going to be urinating as much. And we're going to decrease osmotic pressure in the vessels, right? Because now we're dropping that solute concentration. We have it now more blood volume, meaning more water in the blood vessels. Okay. Now the second hormone that's produced by the posterior pituitary is called oxytocin. So oxytocin is actually referred to as the love hormone, but be sure to call it oxytocin, right? You know, it has a few different functions. First one is actually helps us stimulate labor contractions and the milk letdown reflex during breastfeeding. So what that means, so milk letdown just means that it causes the breast muscles to contract in biological females. So breast milk is ejected out of the milk duct so baby can have breast milk. Okay. Oxytocin is really important to create this emotional bonding, right? It creates that emotional bonding between couples during sex, especially during orgasm. It also helps create a connection between mom and baby during breastfeeding. So that's why it's very important for moms to breastfeed if possible, right? There are certain instances where moms cannot, but we really do try in clinics to make sure our moms are breastfeeding so it can connect, create that emotional connection between mom and baby. So I am going to end this recording here, and then we'll move into the anterior pituitary gland in the next one.